I just wanted to talk for a minute about this issue of psychedelics. And I know that everybody wants to talk to you about it and wants to change your mind and your opinion about it. And I think that I'm probably pretty close to being on the same page as you. I think when you look at the verses in the Bible where it talks about pharmakia, it's usually translated sorcery or witchcraft or something like that. And the, common understanding is that that's pretty much the something like what was happening in those mystery cults. People were taking a substance with the hope of having a mystical experience or gaining some sort of knowledge or wisdom or insight. And so, that's pretty straightforward. Paul forbids it. It's not a good idea. It's not wise. On the other hand, I think the problem is that we have that word, pharmakia, and when we say that's the only thing it applies to, well, if a Greek person came to the future and saw a pharmacy and a pharmaceutical company and all these things, we have expanded the meaning of that word to mean a whole bunch of other things, medicines in general. And I think when we, it's hard. You're hard pressed to find. Some churches will condemn the use of any sort of thing, and there's other groups that do that too. New agey people. People want to have the natural remedies. They don't like the chemical, pharmaceutical approach to things. But most churches don't forbid their members from using drugs prescribed by a doctor for a good reason. And so, in some sense, if a pharmaceutical becomes legal that is some kind of a psychedelic and it has a clinical purpose, and I'm sure that plenty of churches will just be right on board with that. As far as the use of such substances in church, I think that that's a different story. But I kind of think that in some ways, it's, even though it's the postmodernist thinking and beyond, the meta-modern thinking that's really interested in this sort of thing right now, it's actually the modernist that kind of paves the way for it. Because the modern way of thinking is always just reducing everything to its constituent elements. And every time they reduce something, then they say, well, there goes the mystery. So, I think that's, people had their folk remedies and they probably worked, and then people study under science and the scientific method. They study the plants and the herbs and the things that people are using for different things, and then they find that particular active ingredient that does the thing that you really want it to do, whether it's stopping a headache or keeping you from going crazy or whatever. And then the rest of the plant in some ways becomes unnecessary. And so then they can synthesize it and you just have the chemical that you need. And so I think a lot of Christians, in a sense, understanding that the body is affected by chemicals and all these things, we don't have a problem with, there's a chemical problem in my body and I need a chemical to fix a problem. And so, that's why all sorts of medicines are perfectly fine in most churches. Nobody has a problem if you take them. Even things that in a lot of ways maybe, if it affects your mood or if it affects your neural chemistry, well, doesn't that kind of put it in a similar category to some of the other pharmakia as being mind-altering substances? And of course, then there are other chemicals that we have access to. things like alcohol has been around for forever, and churches pretty generally forbid excessive use of that, but some kind of use is usually acceptable. Tobacco, probably a similar thing. It probably has less of a, I think the detrimental health effects of tobacco use make it more of a taboo than alcohol. But it's still, it's not something that most pastors would say is a sin. Now, when it crosses the line into somebody being addicted, then that, Tim Keller has a whole thing about how addiction, not all sins are I don't remember, something about idols and sins and idols and addictions, and not all idols are addictive, but all addictions are idolatry, or it could be the other way around. But either way, we don't really think about it in the most spiritual terms. And then even beyond that, well, knowing that we are, in one sense at least, we have a material body that is affected by these chemicals. Well, the chemicals that can affect us are even in our food. And, even things like caffeine, that could be a pretty powerful stimulant, and it has an effect. And, there was that one guy who, I think it was on Joe Rogan or something, who quit caffeine for a while, and he had this whole hypothesis that caffeine was the drug or whatever that fueled like the Arab Empire's growth and this kind of brilliant Renaissance explosion or whatever. So that's kind of like, well, we just think of it as like this drink. It's everywhere. Everybody drinks stuff with caffeine in it, or most people do. But like, it was a big revolution at one point in time. And then, of course, even beyond food that contains things like caffeine, there's an addictive quality to things like sugar, and now that we can refine sugar and have that in its pure form, like, well, that's, we got an obesity problem in America, and I think that's a big problem, a big part of it, because sugar hits the pleasure centers in the brain pretty hard, and, it gives you a little dopamine kick, and, we're not often wondering in our churches if we are being sinful in our use of sugar. I mean, there's a good chance that most churches in America will give you free caffeine and free sugar, and maybe not just in the coffee, but also in the donuts or whatever that they share. So the church is pretty okay with those, but they do have a powerful impact. And obviously, people are really into the kind of health kicks, and that's a big thing that, people get into these natural remedies, and a lot of that includes diet and things like that. And, sometimes Christians are really against those things if they have a religious attachment, well, for instance, we really reject the Jewish eating habits, the Old Testament kosher laws, because, we say that, Paul says, and even Christ told Peter, kill and eat, and eat the unclean things. And yes, it meant to dine with Gentiles, but it also meant you could eat pork if you wanted to. And, so when we separate the rules, once we're not making it about the rules and the custom, the thing, then we don't have a problem with somebody who decides to abstain from things for health purposes. I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. And I think there even was some sort of a diet that was like based on this kind of kosher thing, and it was like There's always those things about God's perfect plan, and people take some Bible verse and try to say that it's like the secret to health and you'll lose weight and all this stuff. And, nobody in the Bible cared about losing weight. There was that one fat guy who got the sword stuck in his belly, but everybody else was, looking for their next meal. So, David and his men, they were, eating the carbs in that showbread. They weren't turning away any free food. So, so if it's because of a religious system, then it's wrong for Christians to subscribe to it, because then we are, in a way, I guess, participating in a ritual act of worship. But it's kind of this. It's, on the one hand, Christ liberates us from those laws specifically, but then science liberates us from any compulsion to obey or not obey a dietary law, because now we understand that we are material people and our bodies are made of these things and they need certain nutrients, and we have this. It's good to cook your pork's okay, but you gotta cook it, and we know about food safety, and so the ritual washing becomes a ritual of being safe. And I think I was thinking even something like we do a similar thing even with physical practices of exercise, things like that. And some people coming out of the New Age are really worried about stuff like yoga, but there's plenty of like Christian yoga groups, because they're fine. They're not thinking about it in the terms of this is a way for us to do this Hindu thing and channeling our energies and any of that stuff. They're just saying like, well, this is a good form of exercise. It's good for our bodies to move, and this is a type of movement that's good for your body, for strength and flexibility and all these things. And so it's okay. And so some people might have a problem with the name Christian yoga. But if you say Christian calisthenics and Christian stretching and Christian, whatever, Christian CrossFit, and you listen to Chris Tomlin songs while you exercise, then it's like, it's all great. And nobody cares about what the context in which people discovered the actions that are beneficial to their body, because, at this point, we just know it's good for your body, and you're trying to do it in the context of your Christianity. And I think you understand that. Christianity is kind of the thing that absorbs and morphs all other practices into its sphere of influence, and it kind of sanitizes things, and it changes them into acceptable practices. And so I think, going back to the thing of like psychedelics, I don't think it's something that should probably be happening now. They're not even legal. Now, legality is an interesting thing too, because, at this point in time, I think churches probably, agree that some of the laws that we have in our culture are there for good reasons, and we should abide, by them, because it's to our benefit. Nobody's going to make a case that, like 7-year-olds should be able to buy liquor whenever they want, because they don't have the wisdom to know how to do that. So until they gain the wisdom to act responsibly with something like alcohol or cigarettes or, then the law protects them. But, I think on the other hand, we do believe that our authority, and Christ is our final authority, and his will supersedes that of the law and the government. We render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And so, we already, people have already pondered in the last year, like, some laws that governments pass seem to infringe upon the rights of Christians to do what they believe God is telling them to do in gathering to worship and how they worship, like prohibitions on things like singing and obviously on meeting in general. And, that we're getting into some gray areas there where now the church is not necessarily 100% committed to following all laws, because we're getting to the place where in a secular world with a secular government, the laws could infringe upon the rights of the church and what the church should be doing. So in that regard, I think that's one of the reasons why Christians kind of need to figure out their theology about this pharmakia thing quickly, because we can't just rely on civil government and laws to give us the wisdom. Because, most churches would say tobacco and alcohol are legal, and if you use them in moderation and with wisdom, it's not a sin. But, now we have some states where marijuana is legal, and so is that the position of the church? Probably some churches, but I think a lot of churches still want to draw a different line on that one. And then what if other harder drugs become legalized, recreational use, heroin and cocaine and all these things? Is that then, as soon as it becomes legal, is it no longer a sin? That the law can't be the thing that decides whether something is right for the church. And so that's why I think we need to figure this thing out. Because it may be that in the future, psychedelic drugs are legal. And it could be that clinical use, really defines and figures out their best use scenarios. And so I'm not thinking it's going to be, it's going to happen anytime soon. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 200 years or something, there could be a scenario where psychedelics are used in a church. But I think it would have to look something like this. Like the pastor, I think, would have to be in charge of the person's spiritual health and understanding where they're at spiritually. And, they would have to have the power to decide yes or no for a person to use something like that in the spiritual sense. But I think you would also need to have a doctor who's a Christian, who's part of the church, who maybe, like a physician, who could determine if a person is healthy enough to take on an experience of that sort. And also maybe like a Christian counselor or psychologist or something who would be able to determine the emotional state of the person. And if in the future it's more well defined, like when someone is a good candidate to take these sort of substances and have some sort of a mystical experience, then somebody would be able to judge that. I don't think that maybe it's the best, like just having like the whole congregation do it or whatever. I don't know. I don't see why that would be necessarily beneficial. Then I think it becomes it puts you in the place of a church that's too focused on the experiential. And I think that, to deny the reality of experience or the legitimacy of experience or the goodness of experience is wrong. But obviously that is something that can become an idol. And I believe it already is an idol in many churches, where people seek these sort of mystical experiences through other means. And I do think that, as a church, Paul forbid these sorts of things. And specifically, it probably was the kind of shamanistic use of mind-altering drugs. When he said pharmakia, and it's translated as sorcery and witchcraft, that's what it was. He was saying, don't go to that cult and have that experience. That's not the way. But we do have other practices that can lead to mystical experiences. So, fasting and prayer and meditation and even some of these things like dancing, these have been present in Christian worship environments for a long time. And so maybe, it could be in this scenario that there's a person who really would benefit from having a mystical experience, and these drugs are available that supposedly, in the correct dosage and in the correct environment, would help them to do that. I think that it would still be wise for pastors and leaders to maybe require that if you're seeking this thing, and maybe it would, because it's they're saying that it is beneficial for people, sometimes it helps people break addiction. Well, that would be good if somebody's addicted to something else. However, if somebody is already addicted to some other thing, then they have some sort of a propensity towards addiction. And so therefore, they may be in danger of becoming addicted to not necessarily psychedelic drugs, but to mystical experiences or experiential forms of worship. And they would not focus correctly on discipline and things like that. So I think that it would be very smart to have a requirement that people who want to have this chemically induced experience must be willing, at least beforehand, to practice some of these other discipline things first. They must be willing to practice maybe somewhat of an extended fast, or maybe even like a fast of sleep and a time of prayer and meditation and things like that. Like the all-night vigil, staying up all night, and that is another type of fast. So, because I'm thinking about people who are extremely obese, and need surgery to lose the weight. The doctors still usually require them to lose a certain amount of weight through diet and exercise, maybe 10%, maybe 5%, I don't know, something like that. So if you need to lose 500 pounds, you got to figure out how to lose 50 pounds on your own. Not because that's so beneficial to having the surgery, but because you need to prove that you are at least the person who's dedicated enough to the end goal that you're willing to make some sacrifice, that you're willing to take some steps and have some amount of discipline to achieve that goal. If you're not willing to do anything and you only want the instantaneous fix, the surgical fix or the pharmaceutical fix, then I think that shows that you're not a person who's a good candidate for that thing. So I think that would be some of the guidelines that would have to be in place. So, and really, I'm thinking this is so far in the future that perhaps, if psychedelic use became so widespread in culture, then the place for the Christians would be to, in general, abstain because we don't live by the culture, but then perhaps occasionally use it when it's wise. And in that sense, maybe it wouldn't even be the pastor approving it. Maybe it would even just be that pastors could be creating a scenario that constitutes the sort of envelope of wisdom, the environment, the setting, and that maybe there's just worship services of some sort that are the right liturgy, the right pattern, the right setting, so that somebody could, under a prescription of a doctor, go to that place, and that would be the place where they use their substance that was prescribed to them. It could be something like that. In which case, what is the pastor doing in some sense? Probably just creating a sort of a worship environment that is, going to be not manipulative towards the senses, but has all of the things in place that would help a variety of different peoples connect in an experiential way of worship, which I think is important. But, I think that, that's kind of the power of being able to reduce these things to their constituent elements and to say, well, for some reason when we do this, it affects our body a certain way. When we shout really loud, it affects our body a certain way. When we speak really quietly, when we close our eyes, when we listen to certain types of music, when we have certain types of lights and colors, it affects our body in certain ways. And the cynical person just says, well, you're just manipulating people by doing all these things. But in a sense, well, isn't it wisdom to use all the things that we have in order to connect as best we can to God? Like if you want to meet attractive people, it behooves you to diet and to exercise. And if you want them to be interesting people as well, you need to become an interesting person. So, we you can't just say, we can't just be resentful because I got everything that I wanted in life, but it was just because I did a bunch of stuff that manipulated people into liking me. And, well, that's kind of just the name of the game. We become better people by trying to improve ourselves and do things. So I think that is kind of part of the thing I'm thinking about. And I think the Protestant church is the place where it could potentially happen. I think the appeal that's for so many people right now in the Orthodox Church is that the Orthodox Church doesn't care about the fact that things can be broken into a bunch of constituent elements and lose their meaning. They're selling you the whole package. They're maintaining the whole package. They're not trying to deconstruct anything, And I think that, it's kind of a trick in a way that people who come from such a modernistic worldview and are disappointed because they deconstructed the evangelical church or the Protestant church or all these things, they go to this new environment and they're not really allowed to deconstruct it. There's no room for them to bug the pastor about why we do things this way and why are you wearing those fancy clothes and why do we drink out of this cup and whatever, because the tradition is so established that the tradition itself becomes the vehicle for maintaining the tradition. And so I think it's impervious to deconstruction and it's foreign, and so it kind of gets people there. It gets people to that kind of mystical place. It helps them to have that mystical connection that's missing, when they go to the gray box church and either it's really bland or it just looks like the world with the fog machines and the rock stars and, all this stuff. It's all very disheartening. But I think that really, if we're not afraid, we realize we can take all that stuff apart and we can find the stuff that it's made of. That doesn't mean that God's not still there. In 100 years or 1,000 years, we might be able to look at even smaller things and take things apart even further. And for some reason, the universe will still be working. And so I don't think that we're never going to get rid of God by researching too much. But some people are, I think that's the thing that people have been scared of, and that's what's sending people to these other kind of things. So that's what I think, about the psychedelics. As an open person, I can see the appeal. It's tempting in a way, but I feel like if I was to try to do something like that, it's like maybe I would see a vision of God and Jesus would say, like, why did you do that? You should have known better. Don't do that again. And so I think that everything that's good that he wants to give us, we get in his timing. I think Adam and Eve, they probably would have gotten to eat of the tree. And I mean, there's something to the fact they ate from a tree and their minds were changed. Is that a psychedelic plant? I don't know. How did we find out how many plants are poisonous and deadly? People weren't necessarily starving. I think people were trying to eat all these things because they were trying to find the magic tree again. People were trying to find the thing that they could eat that would give them the experience. I think that was the technological search of the early man. And, but I think, Adam and Eve, they took something that God created, and it was something that God created, and God created the world and said it was good. So it was something good, but they didn't wait for his time. He said, and even, Adam counted all the animals, and there was no mate for him. There was no companion. And God said that was not good. So Adam knew good. He was created good, very good. And then he experienced not good. But then God created a woman for him. And that was very good. And so Adam should have known that sometimes we go without, but God gives us what we need when we need it. And I think that people didn't wait for Adam and Eve. They didn't wait for God's timing with the tree. But if they had waited, then he would have given it to them. And so maybe it's the same thing with the psychedelics or the experience. If we're looking for the experience, I think we need to wait on God's timing to have that experience. And I think that the more we wait, the better off we'll be. I think that we will be rewarded for waiting. So that's all I got.